Thank you, ma'am, for the very interesting talk. We can now have a few questions.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I was just wondering, what does the role of class play in the in writing the history of Adivasi people when contextualized within the Indian society? Also, if you could please allow a follow-up, do you consider Adivasi to be a class in itself? I mean, when we are at the center versus margin level. Thank you.
Would you like to take a few questions first and then, yeah, okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I came a little late, so I don't know how the parts of the talk hang together. But at some point you spoke about Professor Thapa's embedded and externalized histories, and in some way their resonance with these new histories of Adivasi narratives of dispossession or myths and legends. And around that moment, you also spoke about Dalton and Weasley and others culling out certain aspects from their past to the exclusion of others. And Professor Thapar also leaves that aspect of embedded histories to be prized out by the trained historian. There's a bit of a collapse here. First, Professor Thapar writes, sort of introduces that formulation in regard to myths and legends in ancient India. She's written at length, and the most contemporary statement is that book, on that 750-page book on Indian pasts. And also the point about insights waiting to be prized out leaves a great deal of agency to the historian or the character who prizes it out. I'm slightly uncomfortable about those resonances. If then Dalton and others are wrong in prizing certain aspects out which you implied, and others, such as Professor Thapar, are more qualified, then what happens to the, hypothetically, then what happens to the Adivasi voice? In both cases, the Adivasi voice is marginalized, waiting for somebody else to pull out the relevant components, I suppose, of their histories. In one case, it's the colonial master administrator. In another case, it's a distinguished historian. One of them you assume to be more trained than another, more qualified in some ways. I'm slightly uncomfortable with that resonance.
Sanjukta Di, I'm most intrigued by your opening slide, which, in addition to Jaipal Singh's photo, had photos of other women from the community, in addition to her mutual friend Ruby, of course. But I'd love to know about the other women who feature in your slide. Who are they and why you choose to include them in your opening slide?
You've been talking about this paper. It's an amazing paper, by the way, and thank you for it. One question that I do have for you is that, according to me, there has always been back and forth between a subaltern studies and history, and been writing on Spivak. For Jaipal Singh, I mean, the last bits is something that is extremely enduring in the way. When you are talking about agency, it is a time of confrontations where you are deconstructing the nationalist historic moments of how the representation is. Rather, it's more cognitive ways of how subaltern consciousness has been built. So in a way, if you don't mind kind of relating it to a certain sense of methodology by which how this historic back and forth between a historian and subaltern studies, in a way, who confronts the other. It is a matter of confrontations rather than irreducibility, or in a way of how how do you situate subaltern studies here, which is more of a confrontation, more of a rebel, more of a subaltern consciousness, more cognitive, the voices of those who are, which I do feel from your last bits is so powerful. So methodologically, that would be great to hear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for these great questions. Well, do you consider Adivasis as a class and the role of class in this writing of? Yes, there is a certain class always working over here, and we have to understand. And what, perhaps if you go through the kind of narratives that, or the kind of divisions I've made, these are groupings on the basis of let's call it power groups rather than just as class. So you have, of course, a state, a ruling class-based aspect to it. You can widen that certainly to look at it that way. But Adivasis as a class, when we are looking at class, I think that will be very difficult, because of course Adivasi is a much more umbrella term among various, which incorporates various classes. But to take Adivasis as a single class, I would find it a little difficult.
Just sort of clarification.
I mean, I don't know, just because it is not only, what I'm trying to say is that it is not only it has been reduced to a kind of a story of people being displaced, but there are various other aspects of Adivasi, of any people's history, which is kind of, which gets lost in the process. So there is a lot of, I would not like to use this, because there is a lot of conflict also within Adivasi, and this is not just something which is happening today. It is something which happened in the 19th century. I've not looked into the records earlier, but yes, I am willing to bet there were always these movements and conflicts within communities.
One more follow-up, please. Just one. I do not mean class as in classical Marxism. I do mean class a way you have meant, more as a power group and less as a very solid and a very uniform state of the society. But I do mean class as a very transcendental term. When as I was saying, when looking at the political context of the Indian society. So yes, and I do not mean in strictly in a pre-modern or a post-modern sense. I mean it within the realms of history.
Yes, but is there any need actually? This is again, it is. I think this complicates issues. There is really, adding class is not really going to add any kind of value, I think, or any further nuance to the kind of debate that we have. But that is the way I look at it. Anirban, yes, you have come in late, and I think I was not at all clear in what I said, because I think in that case what the questions you have stated is not what I wanted to say at all. And if I have left that impression, then I'm afraid that my entire paper has been pretty unclear. So when I'm talking about embedded histories and the externalized histories, I would employ these to really understand the village stories, the village origin stories. I'm not talking about new histories. I'm not talking about the ways in which Adivasi intellectuals today try to reinscribe themselves either for or against the national mainstream histories. I'm talking about how villages are formed. And I'm talking about, and I'm not suggesting at all that colonial historians prized out these histories. In fact, Dalton, for example, was completely against anything. He said all of this is just nonsense. They don't have a sense of the past. But it is the revenue officers who would utilize these for a very utilitarian purpose. And the utilitarian purpose is to determine land rights. And how will they determine land rights? By looking at who were the people who established the village, who were the clan groups, etc. And in this, what I would argue is that when you are looking at the village stories, now I have not attempted in this paper to also deconstruct as a historian. I do not claim to be of Ravila Thakur's stature, but I do think I can utilize her insights to try to understand these stories. And I have not actually engaged in that because I have tried to give a broad overview over here. But when you look at the village stories, each of these stories, if we are looking for rationalistic explanations of history, these are not rationalistic, okay? Because there is always, when you're talking about the land, there is always the connection to the land is not built by saying, I came here, I saw it, I cleared it, therefore it is mine. That is not good enough logic. But there is, to legitimize that relationship, they have to go through the supernatural. They have to look at the ancestors. They have to look at the world of the spirits. And for the world of the spirits, to an Adivasi, is as real to them as, well, documents and attestations were to the colonial officer. And in fact, Koshi Ghosh, in a very brilliant, unfortunately he never follows it up by writing out the paper, but in a very brilliant talk, he described this as a shimmering land, where the land is shimmering with this ancestors, with the spirits of the ancestors, which is there and which is real. Now it is, if I'm looking at it from the point of view of scientific, rational history as a trained historian, of course, and I am not Adivasi, to me this will not make sense. But I can, and I do think that this division between the embedded histories, Adivasis are also have a reason for using these tropes. What are these tropes? Why do they do it? And this is what I suggest has to be priced out, to understand the nature of the relationship with land. Who is the pioneer? And this is very, very important, because it is the pioneer who actually in a way, has ownership of the village. Okay, so this is actually what I was saying. And as a historian, and I am here on a slightly slippery slope, because I'm not Adivasi. Okay, and as a historian, you're saying that Adivasi voices remain marginalized. No, what I'm pointing out is that these are tropes, these had been dismissed, and this is, I think, where to shorten it, I skipped over many parts, where I was not very clear, that colonial historians disregarded this fact. Okay, and I'm not suggesting that as a historian I have the ultimate, I'm nobody to do it. I do not have the, how would I say, the knowledge to do it. Okay, I can only say that these are tropes which make sense to a lot of people and therefore is useful. And I am nobody to suggest that it cannot be useful. And I, as a historian, am not speaking for anyone. I am looking at the history and trying to make sense of the changes and shifts in the period. Okay, so I think you're also being extremely unfair to me and to catch me out. But
I'll get
so that is there. Now, your question. I ran out of time. This was. I did a shortcut and I just changed the title. I did not have time to change the cover and look at, actually get good pictures, because I had these pictures of all these books which I wanted to do, but I had to scan them, etc. But on the other hand, they also represent part of my narrative on which I have not gone into, and that is where I would like to look at, is there any space for women in this history writing? Are they repeating the same narratives today of the community, which in many cases they are, because of this good woman trope, that Lydia Rao had talked about? Or is there are people like, say, Juliana Lakra, who question this entire narrative. So this is a part where I hope to do research and which I think I want to include, but just for this is of course Ruby, and this is Jamuna Tutu, who was involved with the environmental movement and saving the village forests against the local mafia. Now I am not sure. This is, I think, not what's her name? Anyway, I'm forgetting the name right now, but she's involved with land rights. And she actually based in Ranchi, and she was very vocal about the need to rewrite and the customary laws and grant women the land rights. One of the few voices which were there, and this is something. Yes, sir.
This is
not Damayanti Barla. This is not. I don't think this is Damayanti Barla. I thought that at first, but I don't think it is her. So the reason why I had chosen this was I was trying to show the different facets, different ways in which Adivasis retell their or try to gain control over their own narratives today. So one is of course Jayapal Singh and the way, and yes, I prefer the women to the men. That is my politics. That's another issue. If you're looking at the methodology, I'm not really very certain what what you really are looking for. This is because I am not. If you've seen, I have used a lot of different kinds of writings in bringing out the modes of representation and the changing modes of historical representations. So it is not that I am looking at it through the prism of subaltern studies. Some of it, yes, but that is, that is too simplistic to say. Because yes, of course, we equate Adivasis with being the subaltern, and always these narratives grow up within this rubric of subaltern studies. But this was not my intention, and I think if you're looking for a methodology, it is a very tried and tested. I belong to a very old school and of empirical history, where I am looking and trying to uncover certain facts and certain data, and then trying to build them into models of representation. I would not like to only just keep myself within subaltern studies, and in fact I would say I find some methodologies, it's very mixed actually, if you've noticed, from bell hooks to subaltern, so it's kind of used, but again I find that representation and that voice to be actually much more telling and much more useful in constructing this idea of the modes of historical representation of Adivasis.
Yeah, so I'm from Dumka actually, Santal Parganas. I moved to Kolkata for my masters. Yeah, so my question was, I was curious about the Damini history. Like as far as I remember or I could recall, it was first inhabited by the Paharias. It was pretty much a very non-conquerable area, very isolated. The Santals were given the land, I think in the 1830s, if I'm not mistaken. And it was kind of a way for the colonizers to permeate the Damini. So in this case, was it kind of liberating for the Santal group to get their own space, and what effect did it have on the Paharias? Also, in this case, how do the Santals free their past from the nation building process?
And this is the last part is actually the very intriguing part, because much of the especially when I'm talking about, and I think actually the right person to answer that would be Rahi rather than me, or at least Maruna, though she says she doesn't know this either. But because you see, these social and I was talking about the social engineering and kind of identifying dominant groups, etc. But Santal Parganas was actually pretty different. As you rightly pointed out, it was the Paharias, and this is a kind of a gateway area which brings you within the Chotanagpur region. And this was actually initially looked upon by the British as a method to first of all settle the Santals after 1770 famine, because the Santals were very noted as the clearers of scrub. So they, the Santals, as you know, they had been, they were actually nomadic. They settled from place to place, but not just the Santals. In fact, most of these groups, when you look into the histories, today we think of certain zones being inhabited by a preponderance of certain people. But if you look into the histories, the Mundas were wandering within the region. They were the ones who were the most prominent in the Chotanagpur area, but they also have a history of migration. The Hos who moved from the North Chotanagpur to Singhbhum, they have the story, they very clearly, they don't have stories of migration, that is missing, but they identify themselves as the part of the Mundas who broke away from the Mundas and came and settled in Singhbhum, thereby dislodging the Bhuyas, who were the people who settled there before. The Bhuyas dislodged somebody else who had settled there before. So, these stories of movement, when we think of this forest, we think of the forest as a kind of sedentary, stable space, a forest, that's it. But there is a constant pattern of movement. There were also groups which were nomadic, who would be, follow nomadic courses across the forest. But in the Santals were settled after 1770, after they were employed, especially in the West Bengal districts, for clearing the land which had fallen into, gone to waste after about half the people had died of the famine. But this was also seen as a way by the British to control the Paharias. The Paharias were not agriculturists. Santals were seen as agriculturists. In the early 19th century, it was agriculture which was seen as, to the British, that was the activity, and land, to be valued land, had to be agricultural land, So that was the motive for settling the Santal migrant labor over there. So the question comes up is that how much of an authentic village history do you find over there? This authenticity is easier to look for in the south, in Singhbhum, or among the Mundas, or among the Oraos than the Santals. But this authenticity, again, I would argue, how they established their villages there from the early 19th century onwards, again, it is not accidental. There were reasons why certain clan groups, certain groups, or certain communities of Santals would choose one space and how they sanctified it. So even when they went to work in the tea gardens of Assam and the Duars, even there in those settlements, so this is something which is intrinsic to the indigenous beliefs. So they would invoke that religious, the supernatural, in this case, yes, they do not have their ancestors living in the land, but they would see whether the ancestors approved of the land. So, these are the ways in which they legitimized their inhabitants or control over a certain land. And yes, there was a lot of conflict between Paharias and the Santals, and the Paharias really resented the fact that the Santals were taking over their land, to which the British answer was, well, if the Paharias cannot conform and take to agriculture, they have to give way to people who are more productive, because you're seeing, they were looking at land as being of value only when it is productive land. Okay, and Paharias would have a very different notion of land because they would not be cultivating the land.
Do we have time for another one? Yeah. So thank you so much for your wonderful responses. I have a couple of observations just to share those. and a bit of a clarification as well. You had mentioned Tickle's reference in 1840 and Mann in 1868. I was wondering what perception of history in this writing could you even find, if any at all, of the whole of 1855, which happened in between these two writings. This is one. Another thing that kept on coming in different discussions where the Bengal famine, the Permanent Settlement Act, and the settlement of the Santals from, say, being a nomadic tribe to an agricultural one. So I was wondering if you could enlighten a bit more upon that. And another two things, short ones. One is, it at times is very troublesome to look at only say one or two languages when I'm looking at references. I know it's a very troublesome, difficult, tricky situation to be in, but I think it would make more sense perhaps to be incorporating more languages in our research while we are trying to look at Adivasi or indigenous people's history or their perceptions. And yeah, so like how do you deal with it, and your students while working their PhDs, perhaps even what do you think of oral history as a methodology for understanding and even looking at say songs as narratives and incorporating them as references as well. So what do you, your observations? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll start with your last question first, and yeah, the thing is, my problem is I do not speak or any of the Adivasi languages, though I've been trying, I'm committing myself to learn at least Santali because that is the easiest. You have the greatest access to it. This is in that sense, it is the easiest language. Not easy as a language, but easy so far as access is concerned. And look, every historian has. I'm not claiming to say the last word on anything. I've opened the door for conversation. There will be loopholes. Anirban has whittled away and all my arguments and tried to show how wrong everything is. But
I have a response to that if you let me.
But it is for the ones I have written. It is for the next group of scholars to bring in further insights, and this is where the conversation can carry on. I cannot speak. I'm not saying the last word. No one is. Okay. It has to continue, and yes, certainly the Santali language, or not just Santali, indigenous languages would, and social media. Today, I think what is also very important, because when I'm looking at the historical awareness, historical consciousness, is the social media. In this research, I have limited myself to pamphlets because this is, I would say, I would also kind of stop it with the formation of the state of Jharkhand, because this is when I've been collecting these pamphlets for a long time, and this is a time when the intellectual world was very much governed by the pamphlets and the written word. Today, much of this has shifted to the social media. So this is one. The second, when you're talking about the transition from Tickle to Mann. Yes, indeed. This is also a time when you see that the policies and of the British were changing. Tickle was writing in the 1840s, just after, in the context of the formation of the government estate of Kolkata, which was demarcated as the homeland of the Hos. Okay, and Mann was writing some 20 years later after the Santal Hole. And in between, what happened is that in the early 19th century, the British policy, and in fact in their writings also, their thrust was to look upon the local rulers as the local controllers and the Adivasis as their subjects in rebellions. So this was their main representation. But this shifted from the late 1830s, 1840s onwards, when they began to talk about the Adivasis as having been independent and state, especially the Hos, were described as a stateless people. They are people without a state. They were not subservient to any political power. They couldn't do it for the Nagbangshis, because the Nagbangshis were deeply entrenched, the Mundas. So over there, this could not work. But further south, you see that this idea of a stateless people, people who never were always independent, and therefore only the British could control them. So here you see the transition coming about, and Dalton fully subscribed to this. And Dalton would argue that any kind of alliance with local rulers who couldn't control their subjects was absolutely without any value. And as this shift was taking place, the recalcitrant tribals who would not bow to any authority, they became the people who are wronged, especially after the Hul. That they are people who are wronged, and therefore they need protection, because they are also childlike, because the only way they can seek redress to their grievances is through violent upsurge, but through British civilization they can be civilized into being loyal subjects, etc. As for when you talk about the Bengal famine, etc., now one thing is, again I'm oversimplifying this, it would be wrong also to say nomadic. It is not nomadic in the sense, some groups were nomadic. No, they were probably, there were Santal settlements in different parts of Chotanagpur. But they were people who were on the move, and especially after 1770, it is that you find a whole lot of Santals had been employed in West Bengal, and then they were ready to be settled, and this was seen as an option. And once the Damini Co was opened, you find some of the Santals shifting over there, but there were Santals in other places also. There were Santals in Singhum, they had their settlements. So, in fact, each of these so-called zones of dominance, each of these had numerous indigenous communities living within the same space, and they had their own ways of kind of cohabitation and demarcation of identities. So it's not the same thing as just being nomadic. Yeah. Well,
I think you owe me that response. Sorry if I've come across too aggressive or so on. What I meant was that it was a wonderful narrative, as I read it, of politics over time, of representation of certain components of the indigenous tradition, as it were. If it were Dalton and that generation to begin with, followed by Jaipal Singh and the more latest proponents of a certain kind of tribal indigeneity and rights to land and relations to land. But there were both sides to the story all along, and that's the thread I was trying to catch really. If you had Dalton and his ilk rejecting wholesale the indigenous narratives, you also had what you called more tactical or strategic land reforms officer who accepted a certain kind of legitimacy.
Department, not individuals.
Fair enough. So even if they accepted those myths for their own strategic interests, they did it nonetheless, in a certain contrast to Dalton and so on. So there have always been, I suppose, a certain kind of irony across history in treatments to these narratives of what would appear as historical pasts, which is what I was trying to get to. And that often leaves a certain degree of discretion to the interpreter, whether it's Dalton or Professor Thapa or whoever it is, outside those who believe in those myths. And I was trying to sort of draw your attention and that of others to others. That's what
I have no quarrel with that, because this is what the contemporary Adivasi local histories are all about. It is, to take back control of their own past, and in doing so, creating new myths. And of course, what I'm trying to say, who is controlling the tradition? Basically, it's that. And yes, of course, I I agree with you there. That yes, historians are also
other kinds of invention of myths. Some of those you try to justify as struggles for rights, and some of others, such as the right-wing myths.
But even there, it was not even so clearly
It's a slippery terrain. That's all I'm saying.
even this was not so clearly divided. You know, that I cannot say that this is the place where the claims were being, for land rights no. And also another thing is, as you are saying, there was always in the collectorate an officer sitting over there, probably bored out of his mind, and he had to decide which of the claims he had to allow and which not. But what I'm trying to say is, nothing could be accepted unless it was subscribed on the basis of a collectivity. So it could never be an individual. So even the Adivasis themselves are making up the myths. I mean, somebody comes and says, sorry, you don't belong to this land. He jolly well finds ancestors who were there. So, this myth making is being part and parcel of everybody's participating, but who is controlling it? Who is controlling it is what shifts.
I have a very short one.
So ma'am, you have mentioned something about the spirit of the forest. So I was just wondering, as a historian, do you find any possible connection between the significance of spirits in the context of the forest for the indigenous tribes like Munda in the Indian subcontinent and the Yoruba tribes of African subcontinent? I mean to say, is there any transnational or transcultural transaction possible between these two somehow?
I'm afraid I really am not equipped to answer this question because I really am not very familiar with the anthropology or with even the histories of African tribes. But this again, just if I give a very generalized answer, this spirit worship is not something which is confined to so-called tribal cultures. This is what happened before Christianity. Pagan religions, are all basically, even there is a return to spirit worship, for example, in Finland, where this is a very strong movement. So this is something which is common to wherever you go in whichever part of the world. Now, whether there are any actual, academically, I can look into these concerns and to see whether there are, what would I say, similarities or etc. I'm afraid that I cannot do.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for all the questions.
Just one short question, and the Sanjukta we can answer it over tea also. Thank you for the presentation and for the productive conversation that we had. My question relates to this Constituent Assembly debates that you mentioned. I'm just interested to know whether there were any debates on this very use of the term Adivasi during the Constituent Assembly, or whether they took it as final, or they went on.
Popularized it, after the Adivasi Mahasabha, etc. In the 1940s, Gandhi's follower, A.V. Thakkar, he had popularized the term Adivasi. So Adivasi had begun to be used not just in Jharkhand, but more or less, the central, the Deccan areas, all of these places. So Adivasi by itself, within this region, it was not.
No, I'm talking about the Constituent Assembly.
No, even when the Constituent Assembly, this was something which is accepted by the nationalist leaders. They are talking about Adivasi, they are also talking about scheduled tribes, really. But of course, this is a term which never found resonance in Northeast. But these two conversations, the Constituent Assembly debates, these are separate. So when you're talking about the Jharkhand region, when you're talking about the Northeast, these would happen in different, separate debates. Jaipal Singh would use the term Adivasi very consciously. So far as I remember, But again, I have to read whether he was, because whether replies were coming using the term Adivasi or not, I don't know. But actually, there was not much contestation over the term Adivasi as such.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Before we leave, I'd like to make a small announcement. ILSR faculty and scholars are involved in various research publications. Dr. Shati Guho, Director ILSR, has co-edited a special issue of the journal Shikha Darpan. This special edition focuses on bhasha or language. The journal covers content such as, and please pardon my accent, Ganer Bhasha by Kabir Shumon, Hindu Molvir Islami Ayash, Bhai Girish Chandra Sener Quran Anubad by Borun Chattopadhyay, Adhyapaker Bhasha by Shumit Chakraborty, Footballer Bhasha by Kaushik Bandyopadhyay, Adhyapanar Bhasha by Amitav Das, among others. It is on display outside and can also be purchased. If you're interested, you may contact the ILSR staff. Thank you, and we have tea and some refreshments for you also.